My husband cheated on me with my own sister for 30 years. The day I accidentally found out, I stayed silent. My lawyer shouted, "Divorce him!" But I just smiled. What I did next made them both. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I survived it. They look at me, a 68-year-old woman with white hair and flour on her apron, and they can't quite believe that I was once the kind of person who nearly lost everything she'd ever built. But I did nearly lose it. And the way I didn't, well, that's the story I'm going to tell you now. My name is Margaret Collins. Everyone who loves me calls me Peggy. For 30 years, I lived in a cream-colored house on Birchwood Lane in a quiet Ohio town where the neighbors still waved from their porches and the church bells rang every Sunday morning. Frank and I had built that life together, board by board, year by year. We had a vegetable garden in the backyard. We had 2 grown children, our son Daniel and our daughter Rachel. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit who shed everywhere and didn't apologize for it. From the outside, and honestly from the inside too, it looked like a good life. A real life. Frank was a civil engineer, methodical, quiet, reliable as a clock. That was what I had loved about him in the beginning. After 30 years, I suppose I had stopped noticing him the way you stop noticing the hum of the refrigerator. He was simply there, part of the furniture of my days. I taught piano lessons from the front room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I made pot roast on Sundays. I called my sister Diane every Saturday morning, without fail, for as long as I could remember. Diane, my little sister, 4 years younger than me, never married, always finding reasons why things didn't work out. I had spent most of my adult life quietly worrying about her. When she went through her difficult stretch after losing her job at the insurance company, Frank and I had lent her money, $3,000 that we never asked back. When she needed a place to stay for just a month 3 years ago, we gave her our guest room for 4. I loved her the way you love someone who has always made your life a little harder and whom you have never once stopped forgiving. The first sign, I now understand, came in the spring. Frank began going to the gym. Frank, who had never owned a pair of athletic shoes in his life, suddenly announced he was getting serious about his health. I was pleased for him. I packed him little bags of almonds to take along. What kind of fool does that make me? The loving kind, I think. The trusting kind. The kind of fool that people like Frank count on. Then there were the evenings he came home late from work. Not often, not obviously, but more than before. He always had an explanation. Traffic on Route 9. A project running long. A colleague's retirement drinks. Each reason was perfectly ordinary. That was the thing about Frank. He was an engineer. He built his lies the same way he built everything else. Load-bearing, structurally sound, designed to last. Diane started calling less. Our Saturday morning conversations shrank from an hour to 20 minutes to a quick, "I'm so busy, Peg. Can we talk next week?" I told myself she was going through something. She was always going through something. Then one Thursday in October, my piano student canceled at the last minute. I drove to the grocery store, came home early, and walked through the back door into my own kitchen. And there on the kitchen table, Frank's phone, face up, because he had gone to use the bathroom and hadn't thought to take it, a text message glowed on the screen. Just 4 words. From a contact saved as D. Tonight was perfect. Miss you. I stood very still in my own kitchen with a paper bag of groceries in my arms, and I read those 4 words 6 times. Then Frank came back into the kitchen, saw me, saw the phone, and the color left his face so fast it was almost interesting to watch. I set the groceries down on the counter. I put the eggs away. I asked him what he wanted for dinner. And when my lawyer called me 3 days later, because yes, I had already called a lawyer, he shouted at me over the phone, "Peggy, just file now. What are you waiting for?" I smiled into the receiver. Not yet, I said. I'm not nearly ready yet. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my side of the bed. 30 years of sleeping on the left side had left a permanent groove in the mattress. And I listened to Frank breathe, and I thought about the word D. It took me until about 2 in the morning to let myself know what I already knew. D was Diane. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. There would be tears later, plenty of them, in private, in the shower where no one could hear me. But that first night, lying next to my husband of 3 decades while his phone sat charging on the nightstand, I felt something colder and more useful than grief. I felt the need to understand exactly how much I had lost and exactly what could still be saved. So I began to count. The house on Birchwood Lane was in both our names. We had purchased it in 1997 for $112,000. It was worth somewhere around $380 now, maybe $400 in a good market. The joint savings account held just over $94,000. My piano teaching brought in about $800 a month. Not nothing, but not enough to carry a mortgage alone. Frank's pension from the county was substantial, and in Ohio, after a long marriage, a portion of that pension was marital property. I knew this because I had once helped a friend navigate her own divorce and had sat in the attorney's office and listened. What else? The garden? Biscuit. The way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window in November. The Sunday pot roasts that Frank had always said were the best thing about the week. How long? That was the question that kept returning. How long had this been going on? A month? A year? 3 years? Since Diane had stayed in our guest room? The thought landed in my chest like something heavy dropped from a height. I got up at 5:30, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. Not to write grievances, to write facts, assets, accounts, dates I could remember. The money we had lent Diane, that was marital money, which meant it was my money too. I wrote it all down in my careful teacher's handwriting. Frank came downstairs at 7, surprised to find me already dressed. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," I said. I poured him his coffee. I watched his hands around the mug. Those hands had built shelves in our children's rooms. Those hands had held mine in the hospital when Daniel was born. I looked at them for a long moment, and then I looked away, and something in me quietly closed a door. My lawyer's name was Howard Blum, a compact, sharp-tongued man who had been doing family law in our county for 25 years. He had been my friend Ruth's attorney during her divorce, and she had described him as the kind of man you want in your corner and would absolutely not want to be married to. I called him the morning after I found the text. Howard wanted me to file immediately. He talked about the advantage of moving first, about freezing assets, about getting ahead of Frank's narrative. He was right about all of it, strategically. But I said no. Because here was the thing Howard didn't fully understand. I had no proof of who Dee was. A 4-word text from a contact saved as a single letter was not proof of anything specific. Frank could claim it was a work colleague. He could claim a dozen things. And Diane, if it was Diane, and I was now almost certain it was, would deny everything and come to Frank's defense. And then it would be my word against 2 people I had trusted most in the world. No, I needed something real, something that couldn't be argued away. And so, quietly, without changing a single thing about my daily routine, the piano lessons, the pot roast, the Saturday calls to Diane, I began to plan. The first thing I did was open a personal savings account at a different bank, the one across town where I rarely went. I transferred $1,000 from a small private account I had kept since before we were married, my mother's money, which had always been mine alone. That account was my foundation. The second thing I did was call my son Daniel and ask him, casually, if he still knew that young man from his college years who had gone into private investigation work. "Just curious," I said. "Just asking." Daniel said yes. He had his number somewhere. Good, I thought, and smiled into the phone. Good. The private investigator's name was Carl Reese. He was about 40, unremarkable looking in the best possible way. The kind of man you would forget the moment he left a room. And he charged $120 an hour plus expenses. I met him at a diner 2 towns over on a Wednesday morning when Frank thought I was at my book club. I told Carl everything I knew, which was frustratingly little. I gave him Frank's schedule, Diane's address. She had moved to a rental apartment on the east side of Columbus, about 40 minutes from us, and the license plate number of Frank's gray Subaru. I told Carl I wanted dates, times, photographs if possible. I told him I was not interested in confrontation. I was interested in documentation. "How long do you want me on this?" Carl asked, stirring his coffee. "As long as it takes to be certain," I said. He nodded like that was a sensible answer, and I liked him for it. Howard Blum, meanwhile, had accepted my decision to wait, though he made clear he thought I was making it harder on myself. "The longer you wait, the more time he has to move money," he told me over the phone. "I'm watching," I told Howard. "I know every account we have." That was nearly true. I had spent the previous week going through our financial records, bank statements, the brokerage account, Frank's county retirement portal, the small IRA in my name, and photographing every page with my phone. Howard's paralegal walked me through what to send and what to keep safe. I kept copies at Ruth's house in a manila envelope labeled recipes, because if Frank went looking for anything, that was the last place he would think to search. Ruth was the only person I told. My closest friend since we were 32, she had sat across from me in her kitchen and listened without interrupting, which is a rarer gift than people realize. When I finished, she put her hand over mine and said, "What do you need from me? Not are you sure? Not maybe there's an explanation. Just, what do you need?" I told her I needed her to hold an envelope and not ask questions about it. She said she could do that. At home, I kept everything exactly as it had always been. This was the hardest part. Not the planning, not the meetings with Carl or Howard, but the performance of ordinary life. The Tuesday and Thursday piano lessons, Biscuit's evening walks, dinner on the table. The particular way I had always said goodnight to Frank before turning off my lamp. But I began to notice something shift in those weeks. Frank was watching me differently. Not guiltily. Frank had never been a guilty-looking man, but carefully. Assessing. Once or twice I caught him glancing at me in the middle of a meal with an expression I hadn't seen before, something calculating behind his eyes. He was wondering if I knew. He hadn't decided yet. And Diane. When I called her that Saturday, she was almost too warm, too chatty, too eager to fill silences. She asked how I was feeling 3 times in one conversation. That is not how Diane talked. Diane talked about herself. She was worried. Something had shifted for her too. Let them wonder, I thought. Wondering was exactly where I needed them. Carl called me on a Tuesday evening in November, 3 weeks after we had met. I stepped outside onto the back porch, ostensibly to bring in the empty flower pots before the frost. Biscuit sat beside me, disinterested and warm. "I have something," Carl said. He emailed the photographs to a new email account I had created for this purpose only, using Ruth's home computer. I drove to Ruth's that Thursday morning after my first student left, and I sat at her kitchen table and opened the file. There were 11 photographs, time-stamped. Frank's gray Subaru in the parking lot of Diane's apartment building. Frank entering the building's front door at 6:47 p.m. on a Monday. Frank and Diane walking together across a parking lot of a restaurant in Columbus, her hand in the crook of his arm, both of them laughing at something. One photograph taken through the restaurant window, the two of them at a corner table, leaning toward each other, Frank's hand over hers. I sat with those photographs for a long time. The room was very quiet, except for Ruth's old kitchen clock and the sound of my own breathing. Was this grief? Yes. Was it also a strange, clarifying relief? The relief of being proven right, of not being crazy, of having the terrible, shapeless thing finally take a definite form? Yes to that, too. I closed the laptop, thanked Ruth, and drove home to make lunch. That afternoon, I called Howard. I have what I need, I said. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then, send it to me. Already did, I said. Howard filed the divorce petition on a Friday morning in late November. By that evening, Frank had been served at his office. I was not home when it happened. I had arranged to spend that afternoon at Ruth's, not for any dramatic reason, but because I had learned in the weeks prior that I did not want to be in the room when things exploded. I wanted to be calm, somewhere safe, drinking tea, and let the legal system do what it was designed to do. Frank called me 4 times between 4 and 6 o'clock. I did not answer. At 6:15, I drove home, walked through the front door, and found him standing in the kitchen with the petition papers in his hand, his face doing something I had never seen it do in 30 years of marriage. He looked genuinely frightened. "Peggy," he said, "what is this?" "You can read," I said. I hung my coat on the hook by the door. "I'm sure you can figure it out." "You went to a lawyer without saying a word to me. After 30 years." "After 30 years," I agreed. "Yes." I moved to the stove and turned on the burner under the kettle, because my hands needed something to do. "I'd like you to stay in the guest room tonight, Frank, or make other arrangements. That part is up to you." He was quiet for a long moment. I could feel him calculating. The same deliberate processing that made him good at his work and had made him, apparently, quite good at deception. "Peggy," he said, and his voice shifted into something softer, more careful. "Whatever you think is happening." "I don't think," I said. "I know. Howard has the photographs. We can discuss it through attorneys." He left the kitchen. He did not leave the house that night. He slept in the guest room. But the following morning he was gone before I came downstairs, and I felt the silence of the house settle around me like something earned. It was Diane who called 2 days later. I almost didn't answer. But I decided I wanted to hear her voice, wanted to know exactly what she would choose to say. "Peggy," she said. She sounded like she had been crying, or was performing having been crying. With Diane, I had sometimes struggled to tell the difference. "I think we need to talk. This has all gotten so out of hand." "Has it?" I said. "You don't understand the whole situation. Frank and I, this isn't what you're making it into. I want to explain." "Diane," I said, "my attorney has photographs of the two of you at Carmine's restaurant in Columbus on November 4th. His hand on yours. Would you like to tell me what I'm misunderstanding about that?" Silence. "I think," I said, "that anything else you'd like to say should go through Howard Blum's office." And I hung up. But that was not the end of it. 2 days after that, Frank appeared at the front door with Diane beside him. He had a key. The house was still legally co-owned, and he let himself into the entryway before I had a chance to object. They stood in my living room, in my house, and Frank spoke in the measured tone of a man who had decided that reason was his best remaining weapon. He told me I was being vindictive. He told me that what I was doing would destroy the family. He told me that Daniel and Rachel would never forgive me for this, for breaking up the home, for the scandal, for the stubbornness. Diane stood slightly behind him and said nothing, which was its own kind of message. Then he told me something that was meant to frighten me, that he had spoken to his own attorney, and that his attorney had advised him to contest the asset division on the grounds that my unilateral financial decisions, meaning my new account, constituted marital misconduct. I looked at him. I looked at Diane. I thought of 11 photographs and a manila envelope at Ruth's house labeled recipes. "That's interesting," I said. "I look forward to hearing that argument presented in court." They left. I locked the door behind them, sat down in my armchair, and for the first time in weeks, I shook. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the sheer exhaustion of holding yourself together when everything around you is trying to come apart. I called Daniel that evening and told him, carefully and factually, what was happening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, what do you need?" The same question Ruth had asked. The right question. "I need a few days," I told him. "Tell Rachel I'll call soon. I just need a few days to breathe." Daniel drove up that Saturday. We walked Biscuit along the old towpath by the river, and he didn't push me to talk, and I didn't push myself. The November light was thin and clean, and the dog ran ahead of us chasing dead leaves, and for a few hours, I let myself simply exist in the world without a plan or a next step or an adversary. It helped more than I expected. The first attempt at temptation came from Frank, and it was carefully constructed. He sent me a letter, a handwritten letter, not an email, which told me he had thought about this carefully. 3 pages in his cramped engineer's script on the good cream-colored stationery we kept in the desk drawer in the study. He wrote about the early years, about the trip we took to the Oregon coast for our 10th anniversary, the little rented cabin, the way the fog came in off the water in the mornings. He wrote about Daniel's first steps and Rachel's recitals and the summer we rebuilt the back deck together. He wrote that he knew he had caused an enormous harm. He did not name it, did not name Diane, and that he believed we could find a path through this if I was willing. I read the letter 3 times. I won't pretend it didn't affect me. 30 years of shared memory lives inside of you whether you choose it to or not. And some of those memories were real and good and entirely mine. The Oregon coast was real. Daniel's first steps were real. I held the letter, and I let myself feel the weight of all of it for exactly as long as I needed to. Then I put it in the manila envelope with the photographs and the financial records at Ruth's house. What was Frank offering, really? He was offering me the story of the past in exchange for dropping my claim on the future. He was inviting me to choose the comfort of familiar grief over the discomfort of uncertain freedom. I understood the logic. I understood the appeal. But I had been calculating things carefully for 2 months now, and the numbers didn't lie. He called twice that week. I let it go to voicemail. His messages were measured, non-threatening, almost gentle. The voice of a man who had decided that patience was his best strategy. I relayed the voicemails to Howard's office, as I had been instructed to do with all contact. Diane, for those few weeks, went quiet. No calls, no letters. I knew she was still in contact with Frank. Howard's office had informed me that Frank's attorney had listed Diane as a character witness in his counterfiling, which told me everything I needed to know about which way they had decided to lean. They were a unit now. They had made their choice, and in making it, they had given me a certain strange freedom. I no longer had to grieve the loss of my sister alongside the loss of my marriage. They had collapsed into one loss, which was awful, but also simpler. What surprised me in those weeks was the people who came forward. Ruth, of course. Steady, practical Ruth, who kept my envelope and made me tea and never once suggested I was overreacting. But also Margaret Hensley from the Piano Teachers Association, who called one afternoon and said quietly, "I heard something is happening with you and Frank. I won't pry, but I want you to know I've been through something like it, and if you want coffee some afternoon, I'm here." And my neighbor, Gloria, who began leaving containers of soup on my porch steps without a note. Just soup, warm, arriving every few days, as if she had decided that feeding me was the correct form of solidarity. And Daniel came every other weekend. Rachel called from Seattle every few days, asking careful questions about how I was eating and sleeping, which is how a child who loves you shows fear. I tried to be honest with her without alarming her. I told her I was managing. I told her I was not alone. I was not alone. That was the truth of those weeks. The fact I held on to when the evenings got very quiet and Biscuit put his head in my lap and the old house settled and creaked around me. Had I expected this? No. You spend a certain number of years believing that your central relationships, husband, sister, are your scaffolding, the structure that holds everything else up. You don't notice, until it fails, how many other connections you have built without quite meaning to. Ruth, Margaret Hensley, Gloria's soup, Daniel's every other weekend drives. These were the real structure. I had just never needed to lean on them before. In Howard's office on a Tuesday morning in December, surrounded by Frank's counterfilings and a stack of financial documents, I felt not happy, not victorious, not healed, but steady. Like a building that had been tested by a storm and found to be still standing. Still standing, I thought, and straightened my papers. That is more than enough for now. They came on a Sunday, which was deliberate. Sunday was the day they knew I was most likely to be soft. Pot roast day. The day the house smelled like family, like a life that had meant something. I had stopped making pot roast since November, but they didn't know that. They still carried the map of me from before, the old Peggy, the one who set the table and asked no difficult questions and loved people at considerable cost to herself. Diane called first that Saturday evening, and her voice was different than it had been in our last conversation. Quieter, almost humble. Practiced, I now understood, but convincing enough that for a moment, just a moment, I felt the old pull of it. The pull of wanting her to be sincere. "Peggy," she said, "I think we've let this go too far. I think if we could just sit down together, the three of us, like adults. I really believe we can find a way through this that doesn't destroy everything." She used the word destroy, the same word Frank had used in my living room in November. They had spoken, I realized. They had rehearsed this together, probably over dinner in Columbus, at some table in some restaurant where no one knew them, working out each line. I said, "I'll let you know," and hung up. Then I called Howard and told him Frank and Diane had requested a meeting. Howard said flatly, "You are under no legal obligation to speak with either of them directly. I'd advise against it." I thanked him. I thought about it for the rest of the evening, walking through the dark house with Biscuit at my heels, the old floorboards creaking under my feet, the way they had for 27 years. And I decided I would let them come. Because by then I was steady enough to watch clearly, and I wanted to see exactly what they would do when they had one more opportunity and thought they had a chance. I wanted the confirmation. I wanted to see them without the story I had told myself about them for decades. They arrived at 2 o'clock. Diane had brought flowers, supermarket tulips, slightly wilted, wrapped in green cellophane. which she handed to me at the door with a careful smile. Frank stood behind her, and he was wearing the blue sweater I had given him 2 Christmases ago, a choice that was not accidental. He knew I had chosen that sweater. He knew what it meant to me. He wore it like a key he thought might still fit a lock. I made coffee. I set out cups. I put a small plate of shortbread on the table because I had been raised to feed guests, and I found I could not quite abandon that, even now. I sat across from them at my own kitchen table, and I folded my hands, and I waited. It began as Diane had promised, conciliatory. Frank said he understood that he had hurt me. He said it with his eyes on the table, not on me, which told me the humility was managed rather than felt. He chose the table because looking at me directly would have required him to sustain something he did not actually feel. Diane said she knew she had violated trust and that she was deeply sorry. The word sorry came out smooth and practiced, like something she had said to a mirror that morning. But then, gradually, the conversation shifted. The warmth thinned. The structure underneath became visible. Frank mentioned the house. He mentioned the disruption to the neighborhood. What people would say, the difficulty of selling, the cost of 2 separate households running simultaneously. He mentioned Rachel's distress, which was real, and which he was deliberately using as a lever, knowing it was the place I was softest. He mentioned that at my age, he said, as if age were a room with a low ceiling, starting over was an enormous undertaking and perhaps not the wisest course for a woman in my position. At my age, at my position, I looked at him across my kitchen table, at this man I had made 30 years of Sunday dinners for, and I thought, there it is. There is the actual argument. Everything before this was packaging. Then Diane leaned forward and said the thing she had been building toward, I now understood, since she had arrived with her wilted tulips and her careful smile. She said that if I continued with the divorce proceedings, Frank's attorney would be compelled to raise questions about my mental state. The words came out slowly, like something fragile she was placing on the table between us. She said she didn't want that to happen. She said it would be very painful for the children. She said she was telling me this as my sister, out of love, because she didn't want to see me hurt. Was that a threat? Wrapped in concern, dressed in apology, served with supermarket tulips and shortbread on my own good plates? But yes, that was a threat. That was the clearest threat I had ever received, and it was coming from the mouth of a woman who had shared my childhood bedroom. I looked at her for a long moment. My little sister. The girl I had walked to school. The woman I had lent money and given guest rooms and worried over in the small hours of dozens of nights across 40 years. I let myself see her, really see her, without the filter of memory or obligation or hope. Diane, I said, and my voice was entirely level, I want you to hear me clearly. I have, in the possession of my attorney, time-stamped photographs taken across several weeks, a full accounting of marital assets and any alterations to those assets, and a formal report from a licensed private investigator whose testimony is admissible in an Ohio court. I also have voicemails saved and transcribed, and a handwritten letter from Frank in which he acknowledges causing enormous harm. His words, not mine, written on his own stationery in his own hand. I picked up my coffee cup and took a calm, unhurried sip. If Frank's attorney would like to raise questions about my mental state, I look forward to that conversation very much. Frank's jaw tightened. A small, controlled movement, but I saw it. Diane's face went through several expressions. Surprise, recalculation, something that briefly resembled genuine shame. before settling on something blank and hard. They left 15 minutes later. The tulips sat in the center of the table in their grocery store wrapping, still in the cellophane, forgotten. I put them in a vase anyway, trimmed the stems, added water. They were not the flowers' fault. They lasted 4 more days, and I looked at them each morning and found, each time, that I felt nothing complicated about them at all. After they left, I stood alone in my kitchen, and I felt it. The small, cold tremor of fear that moved through me from my sternum down. They were not finished. I knew that. People who make threats dressed as concern do not simply accept a polite refusal and retreat permanently. They regroup. They look for another angle. But underneath the fear was something else that surprised me with its clarity. A clean, quiet anger that had nothing of hysteria or desperation in it. It was the anger of a person who has been underestimated one too many times by people who had every opportunity to know better. They had come to my house, sat at my table, eaten my shortbread, and tried to dismantle my resolve. They had looked at me and seen a woman they thought they could still move. They had been wrong about that for years. They were still wrong. And now I knew exactly what they were willing to do, the full extent of it, the specific shape of it, which meant I was considerably better prepared than I had been 2 hours ago. I called Howard first thing Monday morning, before my first piano student arrived. They made an implicit threat about challenging my competency, I told him. In my kitchen, Sunday afternoon, both of them present. Howard was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "Did they say that in front of any witnesses?" "No," I said, "just me." "Then we document it in writing today. Your account, dated and signed," he said. "And we accelerate the timeline. I want this in front of the mediator before they have time to regroup." "Good," I said. I hung up. My 9 o'clock student knocked at the front door. I smoothed my hair, walked down the hall, and opened it with a smile. Good, I thought again, underneath the smile. We accelerate. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February at a law office in the county seat. A glass and brick building on 4th Street that always seemed too bright inside, too much fluorescent light for the conversations that must have taken place there. Howard and I arrived early, as Howard always insisted. We sat in the conference room, a long table, neutral-colored chairs, a window looking out onto a bare parking lot. And he went over, one more time, what we had. I already knew it by heart. But Howard was the kind of attorney who believed in saying things out loud until they felt inevitable. Frank arrived with his attorney, a man named Gary Strand, who dressed very well and spoke in a tone that implied he found most situations faintly beneath him. Diane was not present. She was a witness, not a party. But her absence felt present in the room in its own way. The mediator was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Oakes, silver-haired and unreadable, who had clearly sat in rooms like this one far too many times to be impressed by anyone's grievances. She opened the session, explained the process, and asked both parties to begin. Gary Strand went first. He presented Frank's position. A long marriage of mutual contribution, a wife who had, in recent months, taken unilateral financial actions, constituting a breach of marital trust, a situation that called for equitable and measured resolution. He was smooth. He made everything sound like a business dispute between parties of equal wrongdoing. He did not mention Diane. Howard let him finish. Then Howard opened his folder. He began with the private investigator's report, Carl Reese's full written account, the 11 photographs attached as exhibits, each time-stamped, each clearly depicting Frank Collins in the company of Diane, identified by her full name, Diane Patricia Weston, the petitioner's biological sister, across a period of 8 weeks in multiple Columbus locations. Frank across the table went very still, Howard then presented the financial records, a complete accounting of marital assets as of the filing date, documentation showing no unilateral removal or concealment of funds by his client, and a comparison demonstrating that the personal account I had opened predated the marriage and had been established with inheritance funds traceable to my mother's estate. Strand's smooth expression tightened just slightly. Then Howard presented Frank's handwritten letter. He did not read it aloud in its entirety. He read 2 sentences, the part in which Frank acknowledged an enormous harm that I alone am responsible for. He read it once, clearly, and let it sit. Patricia Oakes made a note. "I'd like to address the suggestion," Howard continued, looking not at Strand, but at Oakes, "that my client's mental state is a relevant consideration in these proceedings. I have here a letter from Dr. Susan Marsh, Margaret Collins's physician of 14 years, attesting to her full cognitive and emotional competency. I also have a written summary prepared by my client herself, detailing the specific meeting of January 19th at her residence, during which this suggestion was first raised and the exact language used." Strand looked at Frank. Frank looked at the table. "My client," Howard said, "has been conducting herself throughout this process with extraordinary composure and scrupulous legality. The same cannot be said of the opposing party." I had been watching Frank's face across the width of that conference table, and I watched what happened to it over the course of that hour, the way you watch weather change over a flat landscape. The gradual loss of the controlled expression, the tightening around the eyes, the small muscle at the jaw that worked and worked. He was an engineer. He had built his defense carefully, but Howard had arrived with the actual foundations, and there was nowhere left to build from. Toward the end of the session, Strand requested a brief recess. He and Frank stepped into the hallway. Howard and I sat in the conference room without speaking. Outside the window, a woman crossed the parking lot in a gray coat, her head down against the wind, not knowing she was passing a window behind which a marriage of 30 years was being finally, officially taken apart. "You're doing very well," Howard said quietly. "I know," I said. When Frank and Strand returned, there was something different about Frank's posture, a slight slackening, the architecture of a man who has recalculated and found that the numbers no longer work in his favor. Strand began to speak about revised terms, about Frank's willingness to accept a more generous asset division in the interest of resolution. I looked at Frank. He did not look at me. Is this what 30 years comes to, I wondered? Not a reconciliation, not even a real reckoning, just a man doing the math and adjusting accordingly? Yes, I thought. Sometimes that is exactly what it comes to. And sometimes that is enough. The settlement took 6 more weeks to finalize. Howard had warned me it would feel anticlimactic. Not a single dramatic moment, but a steady accumulation of signed documents arriving in envelopes, each one closing off another door with a quiet and permanent click. Legal resolution, he explained, does not look like a verdict in a film. It looks like paperwork. It smells like paper and ink and the particular staleness of law office air. He was right, and he was also wrong. Each document felt to me like an exhale I had been holding since October. Each signature was a small, definitive act of reclamation. The house on Birchwood Lane was awarded to me outright. This had been Howard's central objective from the beginning, and he had built the case for it methodically. The documented marital fault, the sustained pattern of deception, the financial harm caused by Frank's use of marital funds to support the relationship, and the implicit threat made in my kitchen in January. All of it documented, all of it submitted, all of it considered. Ohio law does not require fault to grant a divorce, but it permits courts to weigh fault when dividing marital property, and the record that Howard had assembled was thorough enough that Strand had no realistic basis for contesting it. Frank had wanted the house sold and the proceeds split equally. He did not get that. He got his workshop tools and certain items of personal property that he had requested, and he signed the paperwork transferring his interest in the property over to me on a Wednesday afternoon in March, in a small room in Howard's office building, with a pen that I noticed had run slightly low on ink by the time it was his turn to sign. I noticed this the way you notice small, irrelevant things when larger things are being settled around you. I also received 32% of Frank's county pension, the portion calculated from the years of our marriage during which that pension had accrued as provided under Ohio law. Howard had worked this figure carefully, consulting a financial analyst to ensure the calculation was precise and defensible. It was not a small amount. Distributed over the years I could expect to receive it, it was significant. Significant enough that when Howard slid the final pension division document across his desk for my signature, he permitted himself a brief, tight smile, which was the most demonstrative I had ever seen him in our months of working together. I signed it with a steady hand. The joint savings account division was completed with one notable addition. Frank's own bank records, subpoenaed as part of the asset discovery process, revealed a wire transfer made approximately 2 years prior to a personal account belonging to Diane Patricia Weston. $3,200, transferred without my knowledge or consent, from our joint marital account during the same period when Frank had told me the money lent to Diane had come from his personal discretionary funds. It had not. It had come from us. From me, as much as from him. And he had transferred it to her without telling me, which constituted a documented misuse of marital assets. Howard had found it buried in 18 months of bank statements. He had flagged it with a single yellow sticky note, and the word here, written in his precise handwriting, and I had looked at that yellow square and felt the specific, clarifying anger of a person who discovers that the deception went further than they had known. The full amount, with calculated interest, was returned to me in the settlement. Howard calculated it to the cent. I appreciated that enormously. Precision, in my experience, is its own form of respect. Frank's counterclaims dissolved entirely. The challenge to my mental competency, which Strand had introduced as a strategic pressure tactic and had presumably always known he could not sustain, was formally withdrawn before the final hearing. The allegation of unilateral financial misconduct regarding my personal account was withdrawn alongside it. Once Howard submitted the documentation tracing those funds to my mother's estate in an unbroken chain going back 14 years. There was nothing left in either claim, and Strand was too experienced an attorney to waste the court's time or his remaining credibility pressing arguments that had no ground under them. I did not attend the final hearing myself. Howard represented me, as he had throughout. He called me afterward from the courthouse steps, and I could hear the particular ambient sounds of a public building. Footsteps, a distant voice, the hollow resonance of a vaulted ceiling, behind his measured voice. "It's done," he said. "All of it?" I said. "Everything we discussed, every item." A brief pause. "Congratulations, Peggy." I was standing in my kitchen when he said it. My kitchen, definitively and completely mine now, with my name on the deed and no other. And I was looking out the window at the back garden, still bare and gray in early March. The raised tomato bed, not yet planted, the south fence waiting for its impatience. But I could see it the way it would look in June, the way I had always wanted it to look, and the fact that I would be the one to make it look that way, and the only one, was not a diminishment. It was an opening. I thanked Howard. He said I had been an excellent client, organized, patient, and remarkably clear-headed throughout a genuinely difficult process. I thanked him for that too. I made tea, and I sat at the kitchen table with Biscuit's chin resting on my knee and the afternoon light moving slowly across the linoleum floor the way it had done for 27 years, and I let the room be mine. Fully, quietly, irrevocably mine. As for Diane, the divorce decree did not touch her directly. She was not a named party. She had volunteered herself as a character witness for Frank and had prepared to testify. Strand had quietly advised Frank not to call her once the mediation outcome became clear, understanding that putting her on the stand would only invite further testimony about the nature and duration of their relationship. She had sat in a courthouse waiting area for over 3 hours on the day of the final hearing and had then gone home without speaking to anyone. I learned this from Daniel, who had heard it secondhand from Frank in a brief, painful phone call. Daniel relayed it to me carefully, watching my face for my reaction. My reaction was very small, smaller than I expected. She called me once after the settlement was final, on a Tuesday evening in late March. I was in the garden, turning the soil in the new raised bed, and I felt my phone vibrate in my jacket pocket. I looked at the screen. I looked at her name. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept digging. She did not leave a message. I did not call back. Not that evening. Not in the days that followed. Not in the weeks that accumulated into a silence that gradually became its own kind of answer. This was not a decision I made dramatically. It was a decision I arrived at the way you arrive at certain truths, gradually and then all at once, and with a quiet that feels less like an ending than like finally setting down something very heavy that you carried for so long you had stopped noticing the weight. There are losses that are done to you, and there are losses you have to choose. Diane was the second kind. I chose it with open eyes, and I do not regret it. And on the days when I miss her, the girl she was, the Saturday morning calls, the particular way she laughed at things, I allow myself to feel it, and then I go back to whatever I was doing. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about grief. You do not leave it behind. You simply learn to carry it in a way that leaves your hands free. Frank moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus in April. He took his workshop tools, his engineering books, the television from the study, and the coffee table his mother had given us, which I had never liked anyway. He left behind the blue curtains in the kitchen, 3 boxes of miscellaneous items he apparently decided were not worth retrieving, and 27 years of wear on the floors and walls and door frames of a house that was now entirely, legally, and permanently someone else's. Mine. On the last Saturday of March, the day after Howard's call, I drove to the garden center on Route 9, the one with the good soil and the knowledgeable staff, and I bought 6 flats of impatiens, a heritage tomato starter set with 6 varieties, and a new trowel. My old one was worn at the handle. I had been meaning to replace it for 2 years. I put the new one in my cart without deliberating, without asking whether it was a reasonable purchase or the right time or what anyone else would think. I bought the trowel. I drove home. I put it in the garden shed next to the impatiens, ready for spring. That was enough for one day. Spring came, and with it the particular Ohio light that makes everything look freshly washed, clear and angled, turning even an ordinary backyard into something worth looking at. I planted impatiens along the south fence and started a raised bed for tomatoes where Frank's old workshop had stood. 6 varieties. I had always wanted to do that and had never done it while Frank was here. That was the thing I kept noticing those first months. The sheer number of small things I had been quietly not choosing without ever registering it as a pattern. No cat, because Frank was indifferent to cats. No dark green bedroom because Frank preferred beige. No watercolor class because Tuesday evenings were when Frank liked the television quiet. Small things. Individually, nothing. In aggregate, an entire set of unchosen choices. In April, I got a cat, Vera, a gray tabby of formidable personality who immediately established dominion over Biscuit. In May, I painted the bedroom dark green. In June, I started the watercolor class and found genuine pleasure in it, which is better than talent anyway. Daniel came for Memorial Day. Rachel flew in from Seattle for 2 weeks in July. The house was noisy and full and wonderful in the way that only happens when your grown children come home. Frank, I heard through Daniel, was not flourishing. The Columbus apartment was expensive on a single income. The pension, reduced by the settlement, required adjustments he hadn't anticipated. Old mutual friends drifted away, as they tend to do. Diane's arrangement with Frank had not resolved into anything stable. She had her rental, her diminished income, and the loss of the one relationship that had been her safety net for most of her adult life. I thought about calling her sometimes. We had shared a childhood no one else could remember the way we could. But she had made her choices knowing I was in the next room, calling every Saturday, loving her. She made them anyway. You carry that, but you don't let it undo the rest. By October, I had finished my first watercolor, the South Garden fence, the impatiens going ragged at season's end, the late afternoon light. I framed it and hung it in the dark green bedroom, where it looked like it had always belonged. I turned 69 in November. Ruth, Gloria, Rachel, Daniel, a few piano families. Gloria's 7-layer chocolate cake. Vera knocked a glass of lemonade off the counter and appeared entirely unrepentant. I looked around my kitchen at the people who had come, and I thought, this is what remained when everything false was removed. Not nothing, not close to nothing. So that is my story. A woman of 68 who discovered she had been living inside someone else's arrangement and chose, quietly and methodically, to dismantle it. I was told I was too old, too trusting, too far in to change anything. I changed everything anyway. What did I learn? That silence is not weakness, that waiting is not accepting, that the life truly yours, down to the green walls and the gray cat and the tomatoes in the raised bed, is available to you at any age. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reached you, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. My daughter died 5 years ago. Every year I transferred $50,000 to her husband. But one day my grandson whispered to me, "Grandma, don't give Dad any more money. Just watch him." What I saw next broke me. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellis. I was 67 years old when my life changed for the second time. The first time was when I buried my daughter. I had built a quiet life for myself in Asheville, North Carolina. A pale blue house on a street lined with dogwood trees, a garden I tended every Saturday morning, a shelf of paperback novels I never quite finished. My husband, Gerald, had passed 11 years before Claire, and after that it was just the two of us, me and my daughter. Until it wasn't. Claire died of an aggressive brain tumor in the spring, 5 years ago. She was 39. She had a husband named Derek and a son named Noah, who was 7 at the time, and had his mother's dark eyes and her habit of chewing his bottom lip when he was thinking hard about something. I adored Noah from the moment I first held him. That much never changed. Derek was another matter. I won't pretend I ever felt warmly toward him. even in the early years. He was the kind of man who filled a room with noise, big gestures, loud opinions, a laugh that arrived before anything was actually funny. Claire had loved him with the particular stubbornness of a woman who knows her mother disapproves, and so I had kept my mouth shut. After she died, I kept it shut even harder. Because Derek was all that stood between me and Noah, and I was terrified of losing my grandson the way I had lost everything else. So I helped. That's the word I used then. Helped. Derek had been working in real estate development, a business that moved in cycles of enthusiasm and collapse, and after Claire's death, the business collapsed more than it cycled. He told me he needed support while he restructured. I wrote the first check for $50,000 6 weeks after my daughter's funeral, while the sympathy flowers were still wilting in their vases. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Claire would have wanted it. I told myself Noah needed stability. I wrote that same check every year for 5 years. $250,000. That is how much I gave Derek Marsh between the spring Claire died and the spring Noah whispered something to me that I cannot stop hearing, even now. In the beginning, I visited often. I made the 3-hour drive to Charlotte every few weeks, stayed in the spare bedroom that smelled of Derek's cologne, cooked Sunday dinners, took Noah to the park, read to him at night. Derek was civil during those visits. Not warm, Derek was never warm with me, but civil. He accepted the money with a handshake and a vague accounting of where it was going. Taxes on the house, a business debt, school fees, an investment that would turn things around. I didn't ask too many questions. Grief makes cowards of us, and I was a coward in those years. But somewhere in the 4th year, small things began to catch in my mind like threads on a nail. The house looked different, not worse, better. New kitchen appliances visible through the window when I arrived unexpectedly one Thursday. A car in the driveway I didn't recognize, newer and larger than the one Derek had been driving. A vacation mentioned in passing. Cabo, Derek said. A business trip. Don't worry about it. That Noah accidentally told me had lasted 2 weeks and included a woman named Tiffany who liked jet skis. I drove home from that visit gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I began to pay closer attention. I started saving Derek's text messages, the ones where he asked for the annual transfer and explained where the money was going. I reread them at night at my kitchen table, under the yellow lamp, with a cup of tea going cold beside me. The explanations were always just vague enough, just detailed enough to sound plausible, just emotional enough. He'd mention Noah, always Noah, to make me feel that asking follow-up questions would be cruel. Was I being manipulated? I asked myself that question 100 times in those months. Each time, I pushed it down. Then came the July 4th weekend of last year. Noah was 12 by then. I had driven up for the holiday, and we were sitting on the back porch together while Derek was inside on the phone, laughing, that loud laugh, the one that arrived too early. Noah was quiet beside me, watching a firefly blink in the tall grass beyond the fence. He had his mother's way of going still when something was troubling him. I put my hand over his. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned close, so close I could feel his breath against my ear, and he said it in a voice barely above a whisper, the voice of a child who has learned, too young, to be careful. Grandma, don't give Dad any more money. Just watch him. He pulled back before I could respond. Derek's laugh came again from inside the house. Noah picked up his lemonade and looked away, back toward the fireflies, as though he hadn't said anything at all. I sat very still. My heart was doing something irregular and painful in my chest, and I thought, what has this child seen? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the spare bedroom in Derek's house, the house my money had almost certainly helped furnish, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the tick of an unfamiliar clock somewhere down the hall. Outside, the neighborhood went quiet after midnight. Inside, I could hear Derek moving around in the kitchen, the refrigerator opening, the television coming on low. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the sounds of a man who had no idea that his 12-year-old son had just handed his mother-in-law a grenade. I drove home the next morning. I told Derek I had a doctor's appointment. Not untrue, I had one the following week. And I kissed Noah on the forehead in the driveway and held on a second longer than usual. He hugged me back with both arms. He was a serious child, Noah. He didn't say things he didn't mean. I was 20 miles south of Charlotte before I started to cry. Not from grief exactly, from something colder and more clarifying than grief. From the specific shame of having been foolish for a very long time. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I began to write down numbers. Year 1, $50,000. Reason given: outstanding mortgage arrears and business debt following Claire's death. Year 2, $50,000. Reason given: school tuition for Noah and cost of maintaining the house. Year 3, $50,000. Reason given: failed investment recovery, tax obligations. Year 4, $50,000. Reason given: medical bills. Derek had mentioned a minor procedure. I had never seen documentation. Year 5, $50,000. Reason given: things are almost stable, Margaret. Just one more year. I had given this man $250,000 over 5 years, and I had never once asked for a single receipt. I put down the pen and looked at what I had written. The numbers sat on the yellow paper like an indictment. An indictment of Derek, yes, but also of me. I was not a naive woman. I had managed my own finances since Gerald died. I balanced my accounts every month, tracked my investments with my financial advisor, Linda Cho at Merrill Lynch, and I had kept the house and my retirement in reasonable order through 2 decades of widowhood. I was not someone who made large financial decisions without thinking, except, it seemed, when grief was involved. Except when Noah was the leverage. How much of my retirement had I drawn down? I called Linda the next morning. She was careful with me. Linda was always careful, which was why I trusted her. But the picture she painted was sobering. I had transferred funds from a moderate risk investment account each year to cover Derek's requests. The account had not recovered between withdrawals the way it would have if left alone. Compounded over 5 years, including lost growth, Linda estimated I had sacrificed closer to $320,000 in real terms. I was 67 years old. I had Social Security and a modest pension from the school district where I had worked as an administrator for 22 years. I was not destitute. But I was significantly less secure than I had been the week before Claire's funeral. And I had done it to myself, with my eyes open, because I was afraid of being shut out from my grandson. The fear came next, as it always does when the shock wears off. What if I pushed back and Derek cut off my access to Noah? He was the custodial parent. There were no court orders governing my visitation rights as a grandparent. In North Carolina, grandparent visitation rights are limited and difficult to obtain without an existing custody proceeding. I had looked this up once in a dark moment 2 years earlier, and I had filed the information away and tried not to think about it. What if Noah had simply misunderstood something? He was 12. Children misread situations. He loved his father, I knew he did, in the complicated way that children love imperfect parents. Perhaps this was nothing. But I kept coming back to his face on that porch. The stillness, the careful voice, the way he had looked away immediately after, the way a person looks away when they've said something they can't take back and aren't sure they should have said at all. Noah was not a dramatic child. He was not given to exaggeration. He was his mother's son, measured, observant, precise. He had told me to watch, so I would watch. But watching alone wasn't enough. I knew that much. If Derek had been misusing the money, and everything in my body told me he had, then watching without documentation was useless. I needed to understand exactly what he had done with $250,000. I needed records. I needed possibly a lawyer. And I needed to do all of this without alarming Derek, without giving him any reason to restrict my access to Noah before I had solid ground beneath my feet. I turned to a fresh page on the legal pad. At the top, I wrote one word: plan. The first thing I wrote beneath it was this: stop the transfers. Permanently. And don't explain why. Not yet. The next annual transfer wasn't due until March, 8 months away. I had time. Not unlimited time. Derek would start asking in January. He always started asking in January. But enough time to build something real before I had to show my hand. The second thing I wrote: find a lawyer. Family law. Grandparent rights. Soon. The third: get a financial investigator or accountant who can look at where money actually went. The fourth thing I wrote took me the longest. I sat with the pen hovering over the paper for several minutes before I put it down. Talk to Noah, carefully, without frightening him. I folded the legal pad closed and slid it into the kitchen drawer, beneath the takeout menus and the spare batteries, where it would look like nothing at all. Then I made myself a cup of tea, sat in the garden until the sun went down, and let myself feel afraid for exactly one evening. After that, I was done being afraid. The lawyer's name was Patricia Holt. I found her through Linda, my financial advisor, who had a quiet, efficient network of professionals she trusted and occasionally referred clients to when the situation called for something beyond portfolio management. Patricia specialized in family law with a secondary focus on financial disputes within estates and domestic relationships. Her office was in a converted Victorian house on Merriman Avenue. Bookshelves to the ceiling, a large window overlooking a courtyard, a box of tissues on the corner of the desk that she clearly kept for clients who arrived in worse shape than I had. I was not in bad shape. I was composed. I had spent 3 weeks composing myself. I laid it out for her the way I used to present budget reports at the school district, methodically, with the numbers up front. Claire's death. The 5 years of transfers. Noah's words on the porch. My concerns. My legal position as a grandparent in North Carolina. I slid the legal pad across the desk. Patricia read it without interrupting. That alone told me she was the right person. You have no formal visitation agreement in place, she said, when she had finished. No. And the transfers were voluntary. No loan documentation, no written agreements. No. She considered this with the expression of someone doing a problem in their head. That makes financial recovery complicated, but not impossible, depending on what we find. North Carolina does have grandparent visitation statutes. They're limited, but if the child's welfare is at issue, there are avenues. She paused. What exactly did your grandson say to you? I told her word for word. I had written it down that same night, so I wouldn't soften or sharpen it with memory. Patricia nodded slowly. That's a 12-year-old child signaling distress about something he has witnessed. That's relevant if it comes to a custody or welfare proceeding. She leaned forward. Mrs. Ellis, before we talk about legal steps, I want you to understand something. If you move too quickly, Derek can limit your access to Noah and you'll have very little immediate recourse. We need to document before we act. Do you understand what I mean by document? I understood completely. She referred me to a forensic accountant, a quiet, methodical man named Robert Slade, who worked out of a small office in Hendersonville and described his job, with no apparent irony, as following money to where it didn't want to be found. I hired him within the week. I gave him copies of every text message Derek had sent me requesting funds, every email, every transfer record I could pull from my own bank. I gave him the dates, the stated reasons, the amounts. Robert said he would need 6 to 8 weeks. In the meantime, I changed my own behavior carefully. I called Derek in mid-August. Our calls were monthly, always initiated by me, and kept the conversation light. Noah's school year starting, the garden, a book I was reading. Derek was his usual self, expansive, slightly distracted, filling the silence with the comfortable sound of his own voice. I listened for anything unusual and heard nothing. He did not mention money. He would not yet. January was when he started. But something shifted in September. I didn't notice it at first. Derek's texts became slightly more frequent, not dramatically so, but enough. A photo of Noah at a soccer game, which was kind. A note that the water heater had needed replacement, which was a detail he had never volunteered before, as though he were building a case preemptively. A question, casual in tone, about whether I was doing all right financially. A question he had never asked in 5 years of taking my money. He was sensing something. I didn't know how. I had been careful. But I had learned that men like Derek have a particular sensitivity to the withdrawal of resources they've come to consider reliable, like a change in air pressure before weather. I texted back warmly, everything fine, enjoying the fall. Noah must be getting so tall. Robert Slade called me on a Thursday afternoon in October. His voice was the same careful monotone it had always been, but there was something underneath it, a precision, a steadiness, that told me before the words came that he had found something real. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, "I've completed a preliminary review of the financial records you provided, and I've been able to cross-reference some of the stated expenses with public records. Property filings, business registrations, court documents." I sat down at the kitchen table. I had the legal pad in front of me again, pen ready. "The mortgage arrears in year 1, he said. "There were none. I pulled the property records. The mortgage on the Charlotte house was current at the time of your daughter's death and remained current throughout the following year. Whatever the $50,000 in year 1 was used for, it was not mortgage arrears." I wrote it down. My hand was steady. The business debt in year 2, there was a debt, but it was settled through a separate cash infusion that appears to have come from the sale of a vehicle registered to your late daughter, not from your transfer. A pause. "The school fees. Noah attends a public middle school. There are no tuition records." He continued. I wrote. By the time he finished, I had 6 bullet points on the page, each one a stated reason that had been partially or entirely false. And then he said the thing that changed everything. "There is a second property," Robert said. "A condominium in Wilmington, North Carolina, purchased in year 3. It is registered under the name of Derek Allen Marsh and a co-owner named Tiffany Rourke. The purchase price was $212,000. I cannot directly trace your transfers into this specific transaction. The money moved through several accounts, but the timing and the amounts are consistent." I looked out the window. The dogwood trees had gone red with October. They were very beautiful. "Thank you, Robert," I said. "Please put everything in writing." When I hung up, I sat for a long time without moving. A condominium in Wilmington. Tiffany Rourke. A woman who liked jet skis, Noah had said. A 2-week trip to Cabo that was called a business trip. I thought of Claire, 39 years old, her hair gone from the treatment, still trying to make Derek laugh in the hospital because she loved him and couldn't stop. And something inside me went very, very quiet. Not broken. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes just before a decision becomes permanent. Patricia Holt filed the grandparent visitation petition in the first week of November. It was a calculated step, not yet a lawsuit, not yet a financial claim, but a formal legal document that established my presence in the court system and created a paper record of my relationship with Noah. Patricia had recommended this sequence deliberately. "We want him reacting to us," she said, "not the other way around." The petition cited my consistent 5-year relationship with Noah, my role as his primary maternal grandparent, and, carefully, without specifics, concerns about the child's emotional well-being that had come to my attention. Patricia had worded that last part with surgical precision, enough to flag something, not enough to show our full hand. Derek was served on a Tuesday. He called me that same evening. I was in the kitchen making soup, tomato from the garden tomatoes I had frozen in September, and I let the phone ring twice before I answered, because I needed those 2 rings to settle my breathing. Margaret. His voice was different, not the expansive, room-filling voice. Clipped. Contained. "I got some papers today." "I know," I said. "My attorney filed them." A silence. The kind of silence that has weight. "What is this?" he said. "What are you doing?" "I'm formalizing my relationship with my grandson," I said. "I want to make sure I have consistent access to Noah going forward. It's a legal protection, Derek. For both of us, really. You don't need a court order for that. You've always had access." "I know I have, and I'd like to make sure that continues." My voice was even. I had practiced it. Not cold, even. The way I used to speak at school board meetings when I had to say something no one wanted to hear. Another silence. Then, lower. "Is this about the money?" "The petition is about my relationship with Noah," I said. "That's all." He didn't believe me. I could hear it in the breath he took. "Margaret, I think we need to talk in person. I can come down to Asheville. This weekend, maybe." "That's not necessary right now," I said. "Let's let the process move forward and see where we are." He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood at the stove and stirred the soup and let my heart rate return to normal. He came anyway. That Saturday. I saw his truck in the driveway from the upstairs window, and I had about 30 seconds to decide how to receive him. I came to the front door before he knocked. I had not offered coffee, and I did not offer it now. I stood in the doorway. Derek Marsh was a large man, 6'2", broad through the chest, a face that had been handsome when he was younger and had gone slightly heavy with ease and certainty. He was 44. He looked, standing in my driveway, like a man who had rarely been told no. "We need to talk," he said. "We can talk on the porch," I said. "Not inside. Not at my table." He sat. I sat. The November air was cold and clear. "I know you're upset about something," he said. He had deployed the reasonable voice. I recognized it. Claire had described it to me once, the voice he used when he wanted something. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. If I've done something that hurt you, I want to fix it." "What do you think you might have done?" I asked. He blinked. He hadn't expected a question. "I don't know. That's why I'm asking." "I think you know, Derek." The reasonable voice dropped. Not all at once. In layers, like a stage set coming apart from the bottom up. "You hired someone," he said. "Didn't you? Someone's been poking around." I said nothing. "You want to take Noah." His voice had an edge now. Real anger, the kind that lives beneath performed calm. "You think you can use some lawyer and a visitation petition to take my son." "I want to be in Noah's life," I said. "That's what the petition says." "You stop this." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face closer to mine than I was comfortable with. "You stop this right now, or I will make sure you don't see Noah again until he's 18. I will move. I will take him somewhere, and you will spend every dollar you have left on lawyers and you will still lose. Do you understand me? I looked at him steadily. My hands were in my lap, and I kept them still. I understand you, I said. Good. Then, I also understand, I said, that there is a property in Wilmington registered to you and Tiffany Rourke, purchased in year 3 of my annual transfers for $212,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek's face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, fury, and then something colder underneath all of those. He sat back. That's my private business, he said finally. It may be, I said. We'll see what the court thinks. He stood. His hands were shaking slightly. From anger, I was almost certain. Not fear, not yet. You will regret this, Margaret. He walked to his truck and drove away without looking back. I sat on the porch for a long time after the sound of the engine faded. The dogwood trees were bare now, their branches thin and precise against the gray sky. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. Ordinary Saturday sounds in a quiet neighborhood. I was 67 years old, and a man who had buried my daughter's money in a beach condominium had just threatened me in my own driveway. I let myself feel it. The fear, the anger, the grief underneath both of them. I sat with all of it until the cold drove me inside. Then I packed a small bag, called my friend Rosemary in Black Mountain, and asked if I could come stay for a few days. She said yes before I finished the sentence. Of course she said yes. That's who Rosemary was. I needed 3 days. I needed her kitchen and her fire, and her complete unwillingness to let me catastrophize in peace. I needed to be somewhere that Derek Marsh had never been, in a house that had nothing to do with any of this. I drove to Black Mountain that evening and slept better than I had in months. Rosemary Adler had been my closest friend for 31 years. We had met on the first day of a school administrators conference in Raleigh in 1993, bonded over terrible catered sandwiches and a shared impatience with the keynote speaker, and had been in each other's lives ever since. She had been at Gerald's funeral. She had been at Claire's. She was the person I called, still, when language failed me, and I needed someone who could sit beside me in the silence without filling it. Her house in Black Mountain was old and slightly drafty, and full of books and plants and the smell of wood smoke, and it was exactly where I needed to be. I told her everything. Not in pieces, the way I had been parceling it out to lawyers and accountants, but all of it in order, from the first check I had written in the weeks after Claire's funeral to Derek's face in my driveway the previous Saturday. Rosemary listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, without performing shock, with the particular quality of attention that made you feel seen without being judged. When I finished, she poured us each a second cup of tea. You should have called me a year ago, she said. I know. Probably 2 years ago. I know, Rosemary. She smiled, not unkindly. What do you need from me right now? I thought about it. I think I need someone to tell me I'm not being vindictive. She considered this seriously, which was one of her great qualities. She didn't dismiss the question. Are you trying to punish Derek? I want him to stop, I said. I want Noah to be safe. I want to stop being afraid of losing access to my grandson. Those are the things I want. That's not vindictive, she said. That's a grandmother. I stayed 3 days. We cooked together, walked in the state park in the mornings, watched old films in the evenings. We did not talk about Derek constantly. That, too, was something Rosemary understood. There is a point at which circling a problem becomes its own trap, and she knew when to change the subject. On the second day, a text arrived from Derek. I showed it to Rosemary before I answered. Margaret, I think we both said things in the heat of the moment. I'd like to move past this. Noah misses you. Why don't we get together for Thanksgiving, the 3 of us, like we used to? No lawyers, just family. I read it twice. Then I showed it to Rosemary. She read it without expression. He's scared, she said. Yes. The Wilmington property? That's what I think. She handed the phone back. What are you going to do? I typed my reply carefully. I appreciate that, Derek. My attorney will be in touch regarding the petition. I hope you and Noah have a nice Thanksgiving. I did not say we would get together. I did not say no either. I left it the way Patricia had advised me to leave all direct communications with Derek. Civil, non-committal, giving nothing away. 3 days later, a more formal approach arrived. Not a text, but an email, which his attorney had apparently drafted. It was politely worded and offered, in essence, a proposed informal agreement. Guaranteed grandparent visitation, 4 weekends a year, in exchange for withdrawal of the petition. No mention of money, no mention of Wilmington. I forwarded it to Patricia. Her response came within the hour. This is a man trying to make the legal process go away without addressing the substance. Don't accept. I didn't. What I did instead, in those weeks that followed, was build the thing I had been missing for 5 years. A support structure. I had been isolated in my grief and my fear, managing this alone, telling no one, which was precisely the condition that had allowed Derek to operate as he had. Isolation, I understood now, had been his unwitting accomplice. I called my nephew, Daniel, Claire's cousin, a structural engineer in Durham, who was practical and loyal and had always disliked Derek without knowing exactly why. I told him what was happening. He came down the following weekend and sat at my kitchen table and listened with the quiet fury of a man who had been looking for permission to be angry on someone's behalf. Tell me what you need, he said. Someone in the family who knows, I said. Someone who can be a witness to things, if it comes to that. He nodded. I'm here. I called my pastor, who referred me to a support group for grandparents navigating custody and visitation disputes, a thing I hadn't known existed, which ran out of a community center in Weaverville on Tuesday evenings. I went the first Tuesday of December, sat in a circle of folding chairs with 8 other people, mostly women, mostly over 60, mostly looking the way I suspected I looked, composed on the outside with something ragged just underneath. I listened more than I spoke that first night, but I went back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. I was not alone in this. I had not understood, until I sat in that room, how much that mattered. Derek, meanwhile, had gone quiet in the way that people go quiet when they are waiting to see if a threat will pass. He sent Noah's school photo in mid-November with no message attached, a gesture that was either genuine or calculated, and with Derek, it was impossible to know which. Noah called me on my birthday in December, as he always did. He sounded careful on the phone in a way he hadn't before. Older. How are you, baby? I asked. I'm good, he said. And then, very quietly, the way he had spoken on the porch. Are you okay, Grandma? I'm okay, I said. I'm working on some things, but I'm okay. A pause. Good, he said. Just that. Good. But the weight he put into the word carried more than a 12-year-old should have had to carry. I hung up and sat with that for a long time. I was past fear. I was past grief, or at least past the grief that paralyzes. What I felt now was something steadier and colder and more useful. I was resolved. January came, and with it, the thing I had been waiting for. Derek called on the 3rd of the month, a Saturday, mid-morning, which told me the call had been thought about and planned rather than impulsive. His voice, when I answered, had a new quality, soft, almost humble. Derek was trying on a costume, and I recognized the costume because I had spent 5 years never quite looking at it directly. Margaret, he said, I've been doing a lot of thinking. Is that right? I said. I was in the garden, even in January, deadheading the last of the dried stalks. I kept working while I listened. "I've been thinking about Claire," he said. "About how she'd feel about all of this. About what we're doing to each other." A pause. "I don't think she'd want this." It was a good opening. I gave him that. Using Claire's name, invoking her imagined wishes. It was the precise lever he would have known, from 5 years of observation, was most likely to move me. "What is it you're proposing, Derek?" I asked. He proposed a meeting, in person, not Asheville, not Charlotte, but somewhere neutral. He suggested a restaurant in Statesville, roughly halfway between us. He said he wanted to talk without lawyers. He said he thought they could work something out. He said Noah needed his grandmother and his father to be at peace with each other. Every sentence was shaped around Noah. I told him I would think about it and call him back. I finished deadheading the garden. I called Patricia. She was cautious, but didn't forbid it. "If you go," she said, "you go with the clear understanding that nothing discussed in that meeting has any legal standing. You do not agree to anything. You do not shake hands on anything. You listen." "I know how to listen," I said. We met at a restaurant called the Maple Table in Statesville on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January. Derek arrived before me and had already ordered coffee. Another small signal, the kind of thing you only notice if you are paying close attention. He stood when I walked in, which he had never done before, and held the chair for me, which he had also never done. He looked tired. Good tired, I thought. The kind that comes from performing reasonableness for an extended period. Tiffany Rourke was not with him. I had half expected her to be. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Or rather, Derek talked for nearly 2 hours, and I listened, and nodded, and asked occasional questions that sounded like interest, and were, in fact, a kind of forensic attention. He told me he had made mistakes. He told me he knew he had leaned on me too heavily after Claire's death. He told me grief does things to people. He said this with enough vulnerability that I could see exactly how it had worked on me for 5 years. He told me Tiffany was important to him, and he wasn't going to apologize for moving forward with his life, but he understood that the Wilmington property might have looked bad given the circumstances. Looked bad. $212,000, potentially built from my money, looked bad. "I want to make it right," he said. "I want to pay you back. Not all at once. I don't have that kind of liquidity right now. But we could work out a schedule. Something written up between us, without lawyers complicating things." He leaned forward. "And Margaret, I swear to you, you will have access to Noah. Summers, holidays, whatever you want. But I need the petition to go away first. I need to know we're settling this as family, not as adversaries." He was watching my face carefully, looking for the thing that would tell him whether this was working. I kept my face still and pleasant, and gave him nothing. "That's a generous offer," I said. "I'll need to consider it and speak with my attorney." Something shifted behind his eyes, a tightening. "Margaret, if you bring the lawyer back into this—" "She's already in it," I said. "She's been in it since October. That's not something that changes over coffee." He set down his cup. The reasonable voice was still there, but fraying at the edges. "You're being stubborn about this." "I'm being careful," I said. "After 5 years of not being careful enough." He tried once more. He told me that if the petition moved forward, he would be forced to contest it aggressively. He told me contested grandparent petitions in North Carolina almost never succeeded when the custodial parent opposed them. He told me I was risking everything, my money, my access to Noah, my peace, for a legal action that might get me nothing. He was not entirely wrong about the legal landscape. That was what made it effective. He had clearly been briefed by his own attorney. "Then we'll see what the court decides," I said. He stood up. The performance was over. The face that looked back at me now was not the reasonable one, not the humble one, but the real one, set and cold and stripped of the courtesy he had been deploying for 2 hours. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You said that in my driveway," I said. "In November." He left without touching his second cup of coffee. I sat alone at the table for a few minutes after he'd gone, watching the other diners, the ordinary Wednesday lunch traffic. A couple sharing a dessert, a table of women celebrating something, a teenage boy on his phone while his father read the menu. Ordinary life moving forward around me, indifferent to any of this. I paid the check and drove home. On the highway, somewhere between Statesville and Asheville, I felt it. The fear he had intended me to feel. He hadn't been bluffing about the legal landscape. Patricia had told me the same thing, with different intent. Contested grandparent petitions were difficult. I might lose. I might spend money I couldn't entirely afford and end up with less than I had now. I felt that fear. I let it come all the way in. And then I thought of Noah on the porch in July. The careful voice, the deliberate stillness of a child who had learned to be watchful in his own home. I thought of Claire in the hospital. I thought of the check I had written 6 weeks after her funeral, and the one after that, and the one after that, for 5 years. The fear didn't disappear, but underneath it, something harder pressed back. I turned on the radio and drove the rest of the way home. The hearing was set for the second week of March. Patricia had spent January and February constructing something careful and thorough. Robert Slade's forensic accounting report had been formally submitted, 63 pages documenting the 5 years of transfers, the stated reasons, the verifiable facts, and the significant gap between the two. The Wilmington condominium purchase was detailed with public records. The deed, the registration, the co-ownership with Tiffany Rourke. The purchase date aligned with year 3 of my transfers. Patricia had also filed a motion related to Noah's welfare, supported by a statement from a child psychologist who had met with Noah twice in January, at Noah's own request, routed through the school counselor. That last part had not been my doing. It had been Noah's. When Patricia told me I had to sit down. "He asked to speak with someone?" I said. His school counselor referred him. He went voluntarily. He told the psychologist he was worried about his grandmother and that he felt he couldn't talk to his father about it. She paused. "He's a perceptive child, Mrs. Ellis." I pressed my hands flat on the desk and breathed. "He's his mother's son," I said. The hearing was held in a family courtroom in Charlotte. I drove up the night before and stayed in a hotel downtown. Not in Derek's neighborhood, not on that street that smelled of his cologne. A neutral room with a window facing the city skyline and the particular white noise silence of a hotel at night. I did not sleep much, but I was not afraid. Patricia and I arrived 20 minutes early. Derek was there when we entered, already seated beside his attorney, a younger man I hadn't met who wore a good suit, and the expression of someone who had been told his case was stronger than it was. Derek looked at me when I came in. I looked back. I sat down. The courtroom was small and functional, not like television, not dramatic. Fluorescent lights, wood paneling. A family court judge named the Honorable Sandra Beaumont, who looked to be in her mid-50s and who had, I would come to understand, very little patience for people who wasted the court's time. Derek's attorney opened by characterizing the petition as an aggressive overreach by a grieving grandmother who had conflated her own emotional needs with genuine concern for the child. He argued that Derek had always maintained a positive and cooperative relationship with me. He had Noah call me on my birthday. He shared school photos. He had proposed a mediated resolution that I had rejected. He said the petition was financially motivated. I had given money voluntarily and was now attempting to use the legal system to manufacture leverage I was not entitled to. It was a coherent argument. I had expected nothing less. Patricia responded by entering the forensic accounting report into evidence and asking Robert Slade to summarize his findings for the court. Robert did so with his customary precision and zero emotion. The stated reasons for each annual transfer, the verifiable expenses, the discrepancies, the Wilmington property. Derek's attorney objected to the relevance. Judge Beaumont overruled him. The financial relationship between these parties is directly relevant to the nature and power dynamics of the grandparent access question, she said, and her tone indicated she found the objection unimpressive. Then Derek was called to speak. I watched him take the stand with the particular attention I had developed over the preceding months. The attention Noah had, without knowing it, taught me. Derek was composed when he sat down. He was experienced with being looked at. He had the instincts of a man who had navigated life largely by being larger and more confident than the people around him. Patricia began with the easy questions: his relationship with Noah, his work, the general circumstances following Claire's death. Then she moved to the money. Mr. Marsh, you stated in your initial response to this petition that the annual transfers from Mrs. Ellis were gifts given freely and without expectation of accounting. That's correct. In year 1, you told Mrs. Ellis the money was needed for mortgage arrears. Is that correct? A pause. I may have used that framing, yes. Were there mortgage arrears on the Charlotte property at that time? His attorney objected. Judge Beaumont looked at him. He sat down. Derek looked at his attorney, then back at Patricia. The financial situation was complicated at that time. Were there mortgage arrears? Yes or no? Not technically. So you told Mrs. Ellis there were mortgage arrears when there were not. I was simplifying a complex situation. Patricia moved to year 2, and year 3, and year 4. Each time, she held the documented discrepancy against his stated reason, calmly, without drama, the way you press a bruise to show a doctor where it hurts. By the 4th year, Derek had stopped giving clean answers. He had begun to use phrases like, "at the time I believed," and "from my perspective," and the business context was fluid. His attorney made periodic objections. Judge Beaumont overruled most of them. Then Patricia reached the condominium. In year 3 of Mrs. Ellis's transfers, you and Ms. Tiffany Rourke co-purchased a property in Wilmington, North Carolina for $212,000. Is that correct? Derek's jaw tightened. Yes. Where did the down payment for that property come from? Personal savings and a private arrangement. A private arrangement with Ms. Rourke? With various sources. Mr. Marsh, in the same year you told Mrs. Ellis that her $50,000 was needed for a failed investment recovery, you co-purchased a beach condominium with a woman you were romantically involved with. Those were separate financial streams. Can you document the source of the down payment? The pause that followed was exactly 2 seconds too long. I counted them. I would need to review records, he said. You purchased this property, Patricia said, while telling a grieving mother that her late daughter's money was needed for an investment recovery, and you cannot document where your portion of the purchase price came from. Derek looked at his attorney. His attorney made a motion that Patricia had clearly anticipated because she immediately offered the public property records into evidence before the objection could land. Judge Beaumont looked at the documents. She looked at Derek. She had by now the expression of someone who has formed a view and is verifying it. Derek tried to recover. He spoke about the complexity of small business finance. He spoke about the emotional difficulty of the years following Claire's death. He mentioned Noah. He always mentioned Noah, and his desire to provide stability. He was still articulate. He was still technically composed. But he was contradicting himself. I could hear it, and more importantly, the judge could hear it. He had said the financial streams were separate. Then he said the situation was complicated. Then he said he would need to review records he should have had at his fingertips. Each qualification undercut the previous one. Patricia let him finish. Then she asked one more question. Mr. Marsh, In July of last year, did your son express to Mrs. Ellis any concerns about your management of her money? Derek blinked. Noah is 12 years old. He is. Did he express such concerns? A beat. I have no idea what Noah said to his grandmother. Your son, Patricia said, voluntarily sought out a school counselor in January of this year and expressed concern about the situation between his father and his grandmother and concern about his grandmother's well-being. Were you aware of that? Derek's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in fiction. It cracked the way real things crack. One small, visible fracture across the surface of something that had looked solid. That's... He stopped. Started again. Noah spoke to a counselor. Yes. Without telling me. Yes. He looked at his hands. Something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. And it was not guilt, exactly. It was the expression of a man confronting the fact that the people he had counted on being manageable had turned out to be something else entirely. I looked at that expression and felt nothing toward him. Not satisfaction, not anger. Just the clean, level clarity of a thing finally being seen for what it was. Judge Beaumont called a brief recess. Judge Beaumont's ruling came 6 weeks later. I had gone home to Asheville, tended the garden through the end of March and into April, attended my Tuesday evening support group, had dinner with Daniel twice. The waiting was its own kind of quiet, and I had learned by then to be still inside it. The ruling arrived on a Thursday, forwarded by Patricia with a brief note. Call me when you've read it. I read it at the kitchen table under the yellow lamp. Judge Beaumont granted the grandparent visitation petition. In her written findings, she cited Noah's voluntary participation in counseling, the child psychologist's assessment that Noah valued his relationship with his maternal grandmother and was experiencing distress about its continuity. She established a formal visitation schedule, alternating school holidays, 4 full weeks during summer, and first right of contact in any family emergency. She did not rule on the financial matters. That was a separate civil action Patricia had already filed. But in her findings, Judge Beaumont noted what she called substantial questions about the financial relationship between the parties and recommended that any further requests for financial support from Derek Marsh to Margaret Ellis be subject to independent financial review. It was not a condemnation, but it was on the record. Derek's attorney attempted 3 different settlement proposals through the spring. The first offered $30,000. The second, $60,000. The third reached $100,000. Patricia took each offer to me honestly. Financial recovery in voluntary transfer cases is difficult, she said. But Robert Slade's forensic report, combined with the judge's noted concerns, had given us real leverage. I declined all 3 offers. In June, Tiffany Rourke withdrew from the co-ownership of the Wilmington condominium. The property was listed for sale. I didn't know what had passed between her and Derek. I noted it, filed it, and moved on. Shortly after, Derek's attorney requested formal court-annexed mediation. Derek had found the lines of his own position. He was diminished across that mediation table, not smaller physically, but reduced in some quality of certainty that had always filled the room around him. His attorney spoke mostly in procedural language, the shorthand of a negotiation that has already accepted certain losses. The mediated settlement provided for repayment of $140,000. Not the full amount, but a number with teeth. A formal civil judgment, enforceable against Derek's assets, including the proceeds from the Wilmington sale. The settlement also included a clause affirming the grandparent visitation schedule with a financial penalty for any violation. Derek signed. His pen barely paused. He did not look at me when we left the room. I didn't need him to. Patricia walked me to my car and shook my hand. Properly, professionally. You were very patient, she said. I had a good teacher, I said. I drove home on a July afternoon, the mountains blue in the distance. I thought about Claire, not through grief and fear and the management of Derek, but cleanly. Her laugh, loud and unself-conscious, her capable, warm hands, the way she had loved her son, quietly, precisely, without drama. I thought, I couldn't save her, but I could do this. Most of the money went back into the investment account. Some of it I put into a college fund for Noah, held in my name, accessible at 18. Something Derek could not touch. I stopped on the way home and bought a good bottle of Burgundy. I hadn't bought one in years. I took it home, opened it, and sat in the garden until the sun went down. Noah came to me for 4 weeks that first summer. Within 20 minutes, he was in the kitchen asking what was for dinner with the directness of a child who felt safe enough not to be polite. One evening, the same porch, almost exactly a year from the night he had first whispered to me, he put down his phone. "Are you going to keep coming to see me?" "Yes. It's in writing now. Nobody can change that." "I just didn't want him to hurt you," he said. I put my hand over his. I sat in the dark and felt a fullness in my chest that had been missing for 5 years. Noah's birthday fell on a Saturday in October. We were making his cake, Claire's recipe, her handwriting still precise on the index card, when Derek called. I stepped away. When Noah came back, "Fold in the egg whites gently. Don't overmix." That was your mom's instruction. She had really neat handwriting. She always did. We ate the cake under the yellow lamp, and I was 68 years old, and I was home. What would you have done? Would you have been brave enough to watch when a child asked you to? Leave a comment. I'd truly like to know. And if this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.